Hey everyone, Brendan Sander here. How are you? Thanks so much for joining me and welcome to another episode of Hated Albums in My Music Collection. So, this being the second episode here, we seem to have a good time with the first one. And again, it's not a type of episode that I really thought I'd ever be making because, generally speaking, I love all the stuff that's in my music collection. But sometimes there's those albums, and certainly they can't all be the best, right? But they make such a misstep and you almost just don't even want it in the collection. It's that bad. But I am a completist, so if I bought it, I keep it in the collection, so at least I own it. And there's always those times that I want to revisit it. And even this go around here with these albums, I re-listen to these, really trying to hear, I don't know, the power or the beauty in it. But for me, I got 10 more albums that I hate to have in my music collection. I'm going to run through that with you guys, and we'll get into it here in just a bit. But before we start, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also, leave a comment, hit like. All those things do help support my channel. I'd greatly appreciate it. And of course, as an added bonus, by turning on notifications, you'll never miss an episode, especially really cool ones like this, called 10 Hated Albums in My Music Collection. So, like last time, we're going to do it alphabetically, no rhyme or reason otherwise in the order that I am going. And we're going to kick off with Glam Metal Heroes, Bullet Boys, and Acid Monkey from 1995. It is their fourth studio album, although it's about the length of an EP. It's only got 8 tracks on it. 2 songs on here, or 1 song on here, is actually made up of 2 songs. You might call it 9, but all in all, 8 tracks. Was the first to not be on a major label. Their other 3 albums had been on Warner Brothers. We only have 2 original guys left, which maybe is why the album sounds the way that it does. We got Mark Torrin on vocals and Lonnie Vincent on bass, those 2 guys. But our guitar players and people like that are out of the group. And it's just a major change in sound and style. We've got alternative rock, grunge, power pop. In fact, all the stuff that the Bullet Boys would go on to keep doing after this, they started here on this one. But I got to say, out of all the albums they've ever done, this one here I think is the worst that they've done in the collection. It's just almost unlistenable. I mean, when you're comparing it to how great those first 3 albums are by the Bullet Boys, and they were touted as kind of like a new Van Halen, even having Ted Templeman produce them. And then to go to what this stuff sounds like, you wouldn't even know that it was the same band if it didn't have the name on it. And quite frankly, it shouldn't have the name. This should have been called something entirely different because not only is it not the original guys, but it doesn't even sound like it. Mark doesn't sound like himself. The music doesn't sound like it. It's just, quite frankly, it's a disgrace to what they originally sounded like. And the only saving grace on this is the last track is a cover of Don McLean's American Pie. And I remember at the time when I bought this, just not liking anything on here except the cover. And when that's all you can find to like is a cover song by a once great band like Bullet Boys, I think that tells you everything you need to know about the album. All right, next one up, we're moving on to punk rocker Billy Idol Cyberpunk 1993, 5th studio album. This was still on his regular major label, Chrysalis Records, but he doesn't have trademark guitarist and sound Steve Stevens on here, although he wasn't on the last album either, but he sort of had a good replacement, but that is completely removed from this one here. So just a major change in sound throughout this album, instead of going more punk, because this is 1993 when, punk was starting to come to the forefront, alternative rock was coming to the forefront. He could have gone back to his real roots and I think had some success in a change in style. Instead, he went towards the electronica dance movement, which was gaining popularity as well, but just nothing that his fans were used to. And at the time, I really tried to like this album. I did. There are elements on it that I do like, but there's these sort of spoken word elements on it and then songs that kind of alternates back and forth. And I think if you had taken out those spoken word elements and things that were going on this album, you might have been able to turn it into something. There's one song on here, Shock to the System, that is a really classic sounding Billy Idol style song that was successful off of it, and then nothing else on here is anything like that. And then they would do remixes of this stuff that took it even further away from the sound of Billy Idol. And so there just was nothing to latch onto, in my opinion. I loved that one song. And then after you heard the rest of the album, you were just left scratching your head. And so I want to like this album because of that song, Shock to the System. But again, like I said, nothing else really to latch onto because it just dives into styles and sounds and things that were not what we like from Billy Idol and nothing else. So if you're in a Billy Idol mood, you aren't pulling out Cyberpunk to keep the ball rolling. You're going to end up going back and pulling out something else. All right, next up is an album that, again, I really wanted to love at the time, and I did my damnedest to get into it, but I just can't do it today. Kiss Carnival of Souls from 1997, 17 studio album. It was shelved at the time, in lieu of them having the reunion that they did with the four original guys. And then the reunion was so popular, they decided to release this album anyways because they had an entire album. But Bruce Kulick and Eric Singer weren't there to promote the album, so it just kind of died on the vine. And I think if the album hadn't been shelved and came out when it was completed and it got a proper mix at that time to complete the sound of it and everything, it probably would have done okay. I don't think it would have done as well as their previous albums and stuff, but this album here is so dark and with the down-tuned guitars. I mean, it's definitely their grunge album and not done in a good way, in my opinion. It's sort of, Kiss trying to be Alice in Chains. It just, I don't know, very, very big misstep for them. But what's funny is that we long since had known that Kiss was about chasing trends. I mean, they had so many albums that went after trends and styles and things over the years that there's really no shock that they did this. But by the time that the band is making a return to as a reunion and the classic 70s sound and all of that sort of stuff, nobody wanted to hear the band being something that they weren't. So unfortunately, this comes out, and again, it got some hype behind it because of the reunion. The song The Jungle got played. I remember liking that song. It's probably the best song that's on here, but nothing else on here, doing very well from it or, living on after it. And it's just that sort of black sheep of an album that is within their catalog now that I think most people next to albums like The Elder would wish weren't part of the catalog as a whole. I think this is worse than The Elder. I'll take The Elder any day over this album here. All right, this has got to be the absolute worst, most awful thing that a band has done when comparing it to their catalog. I'm sure this is a good album on its own, but it has got to be the absolute most hated album in my catalog. Lynch Mob Smoke This from 1999. It was their third studio album and first after the band reformed, which made it all that much more a head scratcher because when you know the first two albums and then George Lynch forms an entirely new lineup, he's the only one to continue on from their heyday, brings in a different style vocalist. So, okay, fine, we got the third vocalist on the third album, but now we've got a guy doing rap on here, and it just made no sense. The vocalist, Kirk Harper, I'm sure good in his own right, but not for Lynch Mob. And again, I tried. I mean, some of the music on here, you still hear George Lynch playing his signature styles and stuff, but with the drum loops and the backbeats and stuff like that and the rap overlay vocals, this never should have been called Lynch Mob. I won't even keep this on the shelf next to all my other Lynch Mob albums. It goes in a box down in the basement. It's there when I need to pull it out to talk about it, but that's really about it. In fact, when I popped it on just to give it a listen, to refresh my mind, I probably had not listened to this in at least 20 years, maybe even 25 since 1999. I don't know if it's been that long or not, but I would say that it's probably been at least 20 years because there's just absolutely no reason to listen to it. It's not my cup of tea. I don't like rap metal mixture of stuff. And for it to be Lynch Mob, it makes it even worse. At least if it had been under a different name, I could have maybe gotten behind it, being that George Lynch, who does all these different things and has all these different bands and stuff. But I don't know. I don't know what the thinking was to put it out under Lynch Mob. It just boggles my mind. George, what the hell were you thinking? God, I don't know. One of these times I'm going to have to make a sort of top 10 absolute worst albums in my collection, maybe after I've done a bunch of these types of videos. That one there has got to rank in at number one. I can't imagine another one coming in higher, but who knows? We'll have to see. All right, I kind of debated on putting this one on here, but it really just rubs me the wrong way. Meatloaf, Braver Than We Are from 2016. It was his 12th studio album, final album, but it featured the return of Jim Steinman writing all the songs. So the idea that Meatloaf and Jim Steinman had gotten back together, were making another album. But this is no Bat Out of Hell. It's no Bat Out of Hell 2. It's not even Bat Out of Hell 3, which wasn't that great. But this here is just so far from any of that. It's just a haphazard collection of songs. This wasn't all written as an album anyways. In fact, I'm not even sure that anything on here was written newly for this. I think that a lot of this stuff was pre-Bat Out of Hell and then stuff that had been recorded by other artists gathered up. And so I think that's really why it feels sort of haphazard the way that it does. And they ultimately just feel like throwaway Jim Steinman written songs. And the thing is, it's not that it's that bad of an album. The thing that makes it bad for me is how tired and bad Meatloaf's vocals are on this. And I get it. He was of a certain age, he was older, people don't retain the same glory that they do from their younger days. I get all of that. But the vocals were really so out of place on here, and just even more so when the backup singers or the girls that were duetting with him would come in on it. That was the saving grace. I would find myself cringing and not liking the song, and then all of a sudden the girl that comes in to sing the duet with him would save the song, making it so good until Meat would return, and then it would just sort of be palm plant or whatever they call that, oh God, what's going on here? I don't know why they couldn't get better vocal takes out of Meat, or if they couldn't have just down-tuned it for him, or what the issue was. But, I don't know. I feel like he was forcing it. I feel like the vocals were very, very forced on this. They could have been done in a way that could have saved it, and it just wasn't done. I don't think the overall production on this was done right, and it really just shone the light on how poorly the vocals were for this here. And the album itself is supposed to center around Meat's vocals. So this is an album that I just can never get back to. But stylistically too, it's all over the place. I mean, we got circus sounding music, theatrical Broadway style sounding music, the bombastic stuff, but we've also got alternative rock and jazz and just other things on there. And it's like it can't find a footing. So as opposed to past albums, and especially ones with Jim Steinman where they blended it all, this was basically like one-off song of each of that style on here, and it wasn't blended. So the album just, again, has that haphazard feel. But I don't know. I musically, it makes me cringe. Vocally, it makes me cringe. And even some of the lyrics I just think are really crass and cringe-worthy. I think they were trying to be edgy, but it's not. All right, next one up is again an album that isn't all that bad on its own, but when compared to the band's catalog, it's a huge misstep and one that I don't like having in the collection. Queen plus Paul Rodgers, The Cosmos Rocks from 2008, 16th studio album, first and only album so far at least without Freddie Mercury, although in recent music news, Roger Taylor said he has been speaking to Brian May about recording an album with Adam Lambert, so that may happen, and it may be not the only album without Freddie Mercury eventually, and then we can at least have those two to compare. But This album here, gone is all of the pomp, all of the bombast, all the stuff that we know and love about Queen. And really, we get a blues rock album that would be better under the name Bad Company, featuring Brian May and Roger Taylor, than Queen featuring Paul Rodgers. And I like the album. It's okay, but it sounds like a Paul Rodgers solo album. There is nothing about this except when Roger Taylor takes on and sings one of the songs on here. That is the only time on here that it actually sounds like a Queen album at all. And it was just such a huge letdown and disappointment for me. I had such high hopes for that, wanting to hear at least the powerful Brian May style guitar playing and stuff that we know from past killer songs that they had done, and I don't feel like that we even got that. So I understand we don't get Freddie Mercury, but we also don't get the killer playing from Brian May either on that. All right, this next one here, I don't think anyone's going to disagree with me on, and some people may say this would be the worst album in the collection. Lou Reed and Metallica, Lulu from 2011. It was a collaborative album, and it's definitely a Lou Reed album featuring Metallica. It is not a Metallica album, which is why I'm putting it under the R for Lou Reed and not Metallica. A lot of people, messed that up thinking that because Metallica's the bigger band, that it was a Metallica album featuring Lou Reed on vocals, but it was not. Lou Reed approached Metallica. Lou Reed wrote the album, and Metallica just backed him up. And that's really, I think, the downfall of this here is that had Metallica co-written with Lou Reed, it would have been better. They had very little input into it, only minimal, and I think that's the biggest misstep that's in here. But even as a Lou Reed album, I think it is the worst Lou Reed album. And if you want to call it a Metallica album, it is certainly the worst Metallica album. But it's just the dirgy sound. It's slow, it's monotonous. Lou Reed's vocals don't sound good on it. Incidentally, it was the last album he recorded before he died in 2013, and a very unfortunate last and final album for him to go out on. But he was always making weird off the wall albums anyways, and maybe his machine music, it would be considered the worst. I don't know. But this album here, just not what anyone thought it would be, not what the hype led us to believe, which was the melding of Metallica and Lou Reed. We had heard Metallica Lou Reed cover Sweet Jane, which was amazing. And initially, they were just going to do a covers album of all Lou Reed songs with Metallica playing them and Lou Reed singing. And then they opted to record this brand new album that Lou Reed had written, but it was already complete. And so again, lack of input from Metallica on it, I think, is what tanks this album. Okay, next up, we got Diamond David Lee Roth himself and the Diamond Dave album from 2003, sixth studio album, final one to date. It's now been over 21 years since we've gotten a new album, although we know he did record one more album with John 5 on guitar, but so far we've only gotten those tracks released independently through David Lee Roth's YouTube channel, but no full-length album, and even that stuff sounds like it's not very good. I've not been interested in any of that. This here is a covers album, which makes it all that much more crazy, but we know David Lee Roth loves doing covers, and during the Van Halen days with Diver Down, did some amazing covers. They interpreted these songs and turned them around, making them amazing. Even the Crazy from the Heat EP, California Girls, Just a Gigolo, stuff like that. David Lee Roth could interpret some amazing cover songs. It did not translate through on this, in my opinion. And the selections of the songs were that much more baffling, in my opinion. You've got killer artists like The Doors, but they did Soul Kitchen. Or Jimi Hendrix, however he picked If 6 Was 9. Or Steve Miller and Shabadoo Mama Ma, or whatever that song is. It's just not the ones you would have expected, not the sort of bigger, poppier songs that could have been racked up a bit. But I think that's also the biggest thing that is the letdown here, is just that the rock vibe is not on these songs. It's kind of lounge music. It's not given a lot of thought. It's not inventive. There's just nothing about it that makes it have all the bombast and fun that past David Lee Roth rocked up cover songs from either the Van Halen days or his early solo days just don't translate to this. And then there's three quote original songs on here that are just very lackluster, that have no character. They're almost intros or transitional pieces of music, and you just got to wonder what was going through David Lee Roth's mind when putting this together, and why in 2003. It was also not a time frame for popular cover albums or anything of the nature, and it's on a very small label. Well, when I say small, I mean it's on actually a prog rock label, Magna Carta, but not any label that knew how to push David Lee Roth. But if you look at this, it's just poor album art. He still looks like he's trying to sell the vibe that he's some huge artist, like he's some 10 million selling artist when he's holding up silver CDs, not even platinum albums. I don't know what was going through his mind. It just, I don't know, everything about it, from the album art to the sound to the song selection, just, I don't like. So it's one of those albums, sits on the shelf, never gets played for by me. Now, I know a lot of you guys like this album, and I've talked negatively about this album, and I usually get a lot of pushback from you guys. That's okay. We all hear things differently. But one of the albums that I hate by this particular artist, and I talked about one in the last video that I did, Scorpions, Humanity Hour 1 from 2007. This was their 16th studio album. And the thing is, it features as an executive producer and co-producer Desmond Child on here. And so the idea of 70s and 80s artist Scorpions with one of the best songwriters and producers of the 80s, Desmond Child, coming together should have been amazing. And maybe that's part of the problem, is that my hopes on this were so high. Two of my favorite artists, whatever you want to call it, a producer and musicians coming together. I had such high hopes for this thing. It was such a letdown, in my opinion, such a fall from grace. The band had just come off of making a killer album, Unbreakable, and then they do this. It was just sort of like, what's going on? And it's a very modern metal sounding style album. All the melody and stuff that Desmond Child would bring to his songwriting and things of that nature are gone. I mean, he has produced some of my absolute favorite albums and things, and co-written some of my absolute favorite songs from the late 80s and early 90s, that this here is an absolute shock to me. And maybe some of that has to do with the co-producer on it, James Michael, who is Nikki Sixx's partner in crime in the band 6 a.m., and that's a very modern metal sounding, a little bit industrial sounding band. And so you get somebody who's clearly into the modern metal sound with Desmond Child, who has none of that. And I'm not really sure where they were going with it and why the Scorpions tried to modernize themselves. There's a little bit of back and forth, because the album I talked to you last time, the band tried to modernize in the late 90s, and that didn't work. And then they stepped back and they made a classic album, and then they returned trying to modernize again before stepping back again. So Scorpions themselves have had a number of missteps throughout their career. Luckily, their career has been very long, over 50 years. In fact, we're about ready to hit 60 years for that band, and they've managed to save themselves and climb their way back up a number of times, and they certainly did it following this album. But thank goodness, because this album here, I just think, is an atrocity next to the rest of the Scorpions albums. I pulled it out. I did listen to it entirely from start to finish before doing this review, and I even said to myself, look, it's not as bad as I remembered being in my head. But it was one of those ones that without Klaus Mein's vocals on it, I wouldn't know it was a Scorpions album. All right, and the last one here to talk about, Tesla, Shock from 2019. And boy, was this album a shock to most people. It was their 11th studio album, and so far it is their latest full-length album. It could be the last one, we don't know. We've been waiting 5 years for the band to make another album, and so far they haven't, and so far they keep saying they don't plan to. What was the shock? Certainly the sound, but that they partnered up with Def Leppard guitarist Phil Collen for both production and co-writing. This is basically a bunch of throwaway Def Leppard songs that Tesla does. And gone is the rock swagger of the classic rock sounding style that is Tesla for polished, layered, overly produced sheen that is Def Leppard, which is not the sound that Tesla ever had. Is it a good second-rate Def Leppard album? Yeah. Is it a good album on its own? Sure. Is it a good Tesla album? Not at all. If you want to hear Tesla, there's not an ounce of Tesla sounding music on this thing. And so it's one of those things that I don't want it, much like Lynch Mob having that rap, modern metal sounding album. I don't want it on the shelf next to that artist because it has nothing of what I like about the original artist. And that's what this is. Not a bad album. It's just that it doesn't sound anything like Tesla. And it's just one of those albums that really is a head scratcher as to why they tried to do it. Now, they were upfront about it, and they brought in Phil Collen because they hit it off with him. They enjoyed touring with him at that time. I think Tesla and Def Leppard had been touring a bunch, and so they started writing together. And it was kind of a cool idea, but I really feel like it should have been called Tesla featuring Phil Collen because he plays on it, he produces, he co-writes every single song that's on the album. And in my opinion, really should be Phil Collen featuring Tesla because it is more a Phil Collen solo album than it's anything of a Tesla album. And there you guys go, man. That is 10 albums I hate in my music collection. And again, as a music completist, I'm going to keep these albums, and in most cases, I will keep them on the shelf next to those bands. The Tesla sits right next to all the other albums, but that Lynch Mob album certainly does not. That one I can't even look at. That's just how bad it is in my opinion. So let me know which album you think is that way. Which album is an album you can't even look at? It is just that bad. All right, everyone, take care, have a good one, and I'll talk to you real soon. Bye-bye.